Welcome, dear friend, to a tale woven with both comfort and unease. Picture, if you will, the quiet heart of an English village in midwinter, frost painting lace upon the window-panes, the faint toll of church bells drifting over snowy fields, and the comforting scent of wood smoke curling from cottage chimneys. It is here, among teapots and tidy hedgerows, that our story unfolds, the house where widows keep their secrets. Willowbrook is a place where every smile hides a story, and every whisper carries weight. Tell me, do you believe old houses keep their secrets, or quietly give them away? The parish hall of Willowbrook glowed with lamplight that December afternoon, its long tables neatly dressed with lace cloths and the comforts of village baking, seed cake, currant scones, and sugared biscuits that crumbled at a touch. Outside, snow drifted lazily across the churchyard, muffling the stones and hedges in white, while from the nave next door came the faint strains of impractice, each note softened by the winter air. The ladies of the village poured tea, exchanged pleasantries, and gossiped in hushed tones, the familiar rhythm of their fellowship unbroken, or so it seemed. Yet as the afternoon wore on, a subtle murmur threaded through the chatter. Where was Mrs. Emmeline Harrow? A woman of standing, punctual to the last tick of the parish clock, she was unaccountably absent. By evening, unease had grown into alarm. Her maid, pale and trembling, reported that Mrs. Harrow had not stirred from her drawing-room. Constable Green arrived to find her seated near the fire, her face curiously peaceful, yet unmistakably lifeless. A teacup lay shattered at her feet, and in her expression lingered the faintest trace of fear. Tell me, dear listener, do you think every absence hides a story? Chapter 1. Whispers over Seed Cake. In the days that followed the parish charity tea, the village of Willowbrook hummed like a hive disturbed. Snow still lay thick upon the hedgerows, but the true frost lingered not in the fields, but in the air between neighbors. Every corner of village life, the post office with its clinking brass bell, the grocer's with its sacks of flour and scent of oranges, even the narrow lanes where the butcher's cart rattled by, carried whispers about the sudden passing of Mrs. Emmeline Harrow. At first, voices were sorrowful, couched in tones of sympathy. "Poor soul!" sighed Mrs. Biggs, the butcher's wife, as she wrapped suet in brown paper. "She was delicate, after all. Never recovered from the influenza last winter." Yet soon enough, tenderness gave way to speculation, and speculation hardened into suspicion. At the post office, while sorting letters beneath the watchful portrait of King George, Miss Hartwell confided in anyone who would pause long enough to listen. "You know, she quarreled with Mrs. Lytton only last month. Sharp words over that rose competition. I heard it myself. Others claimed her nephew would inherit a tidy sum, and did that not raise questions about wills and beneficiaries? Gossip, like ivy, wound itself around every conversation, sprouting new tendrils with each retelling. What was at first a sad passing soon grew into an unnatural business, if you ask me." Meanwhile, in a modest cottage at the edge of the village, Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly by her fire, needles clicking gently as she knitted a pair of plain gray socks. Her companion for the evening, Mrs. Price, was full of village chatter, and Miss Marple listened with the mild smile of one who had heard much in her time. "Everyone says poor Mrs. Harrow was frightened of something," Mrs. Price declared, lowering her voice, though there was no one else in the room. "And then there's the matter of her bureau. Locked, mind you, on the very day she died. Why should a woman lock away her papers unless she feared someone might see them? Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "It is curious," she murmured, her eyes never straying from the wool. "I once knew a lady who did the same. In her case, the key was not for secrecy, but for a most practical reason." She left the thought dangling, knowing well that human nature is rarely as simple as gossip makes it. Yet Mrs. Price was not done. Leaning closer, she whispered, "There's one thing more. Mrs. Cole swears she saw Emmeline's teacup exchanged during the charity tea. She cannot recall by whom. There was such bustle, with Mrs. Weatherby bringing more seed cake and the vicar's wife calling for him books. But she's certain it happened." Miss Marple set down her knitting for just a moment, her expression unreadable in the firelight. An exchanged teacup, such a small, ordinary act. Yet, as she well knew, it was in the smallest of acts that danger so often revealed itself. And outside, the snow fell more thickly, muffling the lanes of Willowbrook as if to keep its secrets a little longer. Inspector Crail arrived from Marleycombe on the following morning, his boots brisk upon the snow-packed lane, his breath rising in little clouds of authority. He was a man of tidy moustache and tidy opinions, the sort who prided himself upon efficiency and disliked lingering shadows in his investigations. To the villagers, he presented a picture of calm certainty. To Miss Marple, watching from her friend's drawing-room window, he appeared rather too brisk, rather too confident. His conclusion, delivered with no hesitation, was simple. "Heart failure," he announced, standing in the cold vestibule of Harrow House as though the matter were no more complex than a broken window latch. The woman was elderly, no longer robust. There is nothing to suggest otherwise. Yet, as those words travelled down the lanes of Willowbrook, they tangled at once with rumor. Poison, that dreadful, thrilling word, had begun to creep from tongue to tongue. It had been heard in the apothecaries, whispered in the greengrocer's, muttered at the church porch. Bitter almonds, digitalis, powders slipped into tea. Villagers speculated with a relish Inspector Crail would not have approved of. Later that week, at the vicarage tea, the matter was dissected once again. Mrs. Bantry, stout and forthright, shook her head with emphatic certainty. "Heart failure. Nonsense." Prudence Harrow was lively as a sparrow, and as keen for a brisk walk as any of us. Why, only last Tuesday she declared she meant to reorganize her entire orchard come spring. A woman with plans for orchards does not drop down dead without reason. Miss Marple, seated a little apart with her cup of Darjeeling, listened without interruption. Her expression was one of gentle interest, her knitting bag resting by her chair. She noted, as only she would, the vicar's wife turning curiously pale when Mrs. Bantry brought up the subject of Prudence's jewels, jewels rumoured to have been reset at some expense only the month before. Mrs. Bantry, of course, noticed nothing. Few ever did. Conversation meandered between reminiscences and conjecture, each villager adding a morsel to the feast of speculation. Yet it was not until one of the younger maids, bidden in to collect cups, spoke hesitantly that the true chill of suspicion settled over the room. "I shouldn't say anything, ma'am," the girl faltered, her eyes darting nervously toward the vicar's wife, "but I heard Mrs. Harrow myself, only the night before she passed. She was speaking to someone, I don't know who, I was only in the passage. She said, quite plain as you like, If the truth comes out, we shall all be ruined." The vicar's wife dropped her spoon with a soft clatter against her saucer. Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, the inspector frowned, and Miss Marple, her eyes calm and unreadable, merely stirred her tea once more. Outside, church bells tolled the evening hour, their notes drifting over the snowbound village, as though reminding all present that truth, like sound, cannot be muffled forever. Chapter 2. Footprints in the Snow. The morning after the inspector's pronouncement, Willowbrook lay under a quilt of white so pristine it might have been painted. Roofs bowed beneath it, hedges gleamed with icy lace, and the lane toward Harrow House seemed to hush every step. Miss Marple, wrapped in a sensible grey coat and scarf, took her daily walk as though nothing at all were amiss, though her mind, as always, worked briskly beneath the calm exterior. It was habit, not curiosity, that led her past the Hathaway home, a pretty Georgian house with shuttered windows and a gate that creaked in the wind. Yet here, where most of the snow lay smooth as icing, she paused. The faintest trace of footprints lingered near the garden gate. Not the broad stride of Mr. Hathaway, nor the sturdy prints of the postman's boots. These were narrower, lighter, and curiously hesitant, as though the walker had stood for some time, uncertain whether to go on. Miss Marple bent carefully, her gloved hand brushing the air above the marks. They were nearly filled with drifting snow now, but she had seen enough over years of village life to know when something was out of the ordinary. The Hathaway men wore heavy boots, the constable wore regulation soles, and the vicar's shoes left a wider imprint. These, she reflected, could belong to a woman. A young one, perhaps. Her thoughts were interrupted by Mrs. Ellis, the neighbor from across the way, who emerged from her gate with a pail of scraps for the hens. She was brisk, red-cheeked, and as quick with her tongue as with her chores. "Strange doings, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice as though the snow itself might be listening. "I was awake near midnight, what with the hens fussing. I could have sworn I heard a knock at poor Mrs. Harrow's door. A sharp one, too, as if someone meant business. But when I looked out, there was nothing, only shadows across the snow." Miss Marple's pale eyes softened thoughtfully. "Indeed," she murmured, her tone mild. "One never knows what visits may occur after dark. People do so often prefer secrecy to daylight." Mrs. Ellis gave a conspiratorial nod, then bustled back to her hens, leaving Miss Marple with her quiet thoughts. She continued along the lane, but her gaze lingered upon the snow by the hedge, where a patch looked oddly disturbed. Something glimmered faintly beneath the frosty crust. Stooping with care, she drew it free, a delicate glove, ivory in color, its fingertips faintly stained with damp. Too fine for gardening, too small for most hands in the village, it must have been dropped, or perhaps discarded, the night before. Miss Marple held it for a moment, the wind tugging at her scarf, and tucked it quietly into her pocket. For all the inspector's confidence, she had learned long ago that it is not in grand gestures, but in small, half-buried things that truth most often hides. And this, she knew, was no ordinary glove. Miss Marple never hurried her visits. A polite call, taken at the right moment, often yielded more than any number of constables with notebooks. Thus, on a brittle afternoon when the frost clung to the hedges like spun glass, she presented herself at the ivy-clad home of Mrs. Lytton. The widow received her in a drawing-room that smelled faintly of lavender polish and stale tobacco. Mrs. Lytton was a tall, angular woman, draped in a shawl of deep burgundy, her eyes sharp even in repose. A maid brought in tea, strong and unsweetened, and a plate of currant biscuits. "I suppose you've heard all the endless chatter," Mrs. Lytton began, setting her cup down with a brisk clatter. As if poor Prudence's death were not tragedy enough without every tongue in Willowbrook wagging. People do love to exaggerate. Miss Marple inclined her head gently, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. Yes, village talk has its way of enlarging events. Though one must admit, Prudence had a manner that often provoked remark. At that, Mrs. Lytton gave a sharp laugh. Provoked, indeed. Prudence Harrow was forever needling me. Sharp as vinegar she could be, and she never forgave a slight. There are letters, Miss Marple, old matters, best left in the past. She pressed her lips tight, as though she had said too much. Letters can be troublesome things, Miss Marple observed mildly. They so often refuse to remain buried. The air between them grew brittle, like the frost outside. Mrs. Lytton busied herself with the teapot, her hand trembling slightly as she poured a fresh cup. Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, asked almost casually, "I believe you attended the charity bazaar? It was such a cheerful affair." "Yes," Mrs. Lytton replied, too quickly. "Naturally. One must be seen, of course." "You went alone?" The widow stiffened. "Alone?" "Certainly. Who else would I bring?" Harold was indisposed. At that very moment, Harold Lytton appeared in the doorway, tall, pale, and carrying a stack of books. He nodded stiffly to Miss Marple, muttered something about accounts, and disappeared toward the library. His manner was nervous, his steps hurried. Mrs. Lytton's eyes followed him, then darted back to Miss Marple, daring her to remark. But Miss Marple merely sipped her tea, placid as a cat in sunshine. When the visit drew politely to a close, Miss Marple rose. As she did, her gaze drifted, seemingly idly, to the side table where Harold had set down his books. Between the pages of the top volume something pale protruded. Not paper, but linen. An embroidered handkerchief, hastily tucked away. And not just any embroidery. Miss Marple's sharp eye recalled the exact pattern, delicate sprays of forget-me-nots stitched in blue silk. Prudence Harrow had carried such a handkerchief at the bazaar, fluttering it with almost theatrical emphasis. How curious, then, to find it here, half hidden in Harold Lytton's keeping. Miss Marple left the house with her customary smile, but her mind had already added another small, significant piece to the puzzle. Chapter 3. The Maid in Custody. The first whispers of it drifted through Willowbrook like smoke curling under a door. By the time Miss Marple reached the greengrocer's, it was no longer rumor but proclamation. Inspector Crail had made an arrest. Alice, poor little Alice with her round eyes and timid manner, had been marched from Harrow House and taken into custody. The villagers, huddled in their scarves and mufflers against the biting air, buzzed like a disturbed hive. "They say she slipped something into the tea," confided Mrs. Weatherby, clutching her basket of carrots as though it might shield her from scandal. "Always the quiet ones you must watch." "Mark my words," muttered old Mr. Hargreaves by the till, "maids see more than they ought, and knowing too much leads to trouble." Inspector Crail himself appeared later that afternoon, striding through the square as though the cobblestones belonged to him. His mustache twitched with satisfaction, his boots struck sharp against the frozen ground. He paused at the steps of the vicarage, announcing for all within earshot, "The case is clear. Alice Harrow is charged. Justice will be swiftly served." Miss Marple, standing in the crowd with her basket of wool, said nothing. She merely adjusted her spectacles and observed. Alice was brought forward soon after, her cheeks blotched from tears, her hands twisting a handkerchief until it was limp. "I never touched her tea," she sobbed. "She was kind to me, always. I'd no reason, none at all." Her cries only stirred the villagers further. Suspicion was like kindling in Willowbrook. Once alight, it flared eagerly. Yet Miss Marple noted the trembling of Alice's hands, the way her gaze flitted desperately from one face to another. These were not the eyes of guilt, but of a frightened bird caught in a net it could not see. Later, at the vicarage tea, hastily arranged, as all important gatherings were, the opinions of Willowbrook were ladled out as liberally as the sponge cake. "Well, there it is," declared Mrs. Bantry, leaning heavily upon her cane. "Servants are always meddling. It's the way of things. Give them too much trust, and it ends in mischief." Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, her needles clicking softly. "It may be so," she murmured, "yet mischief and murder are not always so easily linked." But her voice was lost in the swell of certainty. Inspector Crail, presiding with smug gravity, assured them all that decisive evidence would be presented in due course. His words rolled through the room like thunderclouds. And then, just as the company dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the vicarage hallway. From beyond the half-closed door of the study, she heard Crail's voice, low but fervent. "We've found the poison in Alice's trunk." The words dropped into her mind like stones into a pond, rippling outward with unsettling consequence. Miss Marple pressed her lips together, her knitting clutched close. A hasty arrest, yes, but perhaps even hastier evidence. For poison, she knew, had a way of turning up precisely where someone wanted it to be found. The evening had settled heavily over Willowbrook, pressing against the windows of Miss Marple's neat little sitting-room. Outside, the snow glowed faintly in the lamplight, but within all was warm and orderly, the fire burning steadily, the clock ticking with reassuring regularity, and her basket of knitting at her side. Yet her mind was anything but tranquil. Alice in custody. Poison in her trunk. A village content to call it solved. Miss Marple drew her shawl more tightly about her shoulders. She had watched Alice since the girl's first days in service at Harrow House. A loyal creature, eager to please, timid to a fault. Why, Alice would sooner scald herself than let her mistress's tea go cold. To picture such a girl grinding powders and stirring them into a teacup seemed absurd. No, there was something too neat about Inspector Crail's discovery. Evidence, like lost buttons, had a way of turning up precisely where it was meant to be noticed. Miss Marple remembered, with a small frown, a case many years ago in St. Mary Mead. A gardener, accused of stealing silver, until it emerged the silver had been tucked into his shed by cleverer, guiltier hands. People, she reflected, were much the same the world over. Vanity, greed, jealousy, these were the true culprits, wearing 100 disguises. Her needles clicked, but her thoughts wandered. Alice had no money to gain, no freedom to seek, no grievance worth killing for. But others did. The fire popped, sending up a spark. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "No," she said softly to herself, "this will not do." By morning, her decision was made. She wrapped herself well against the cold and took the familiar path toward Harrow House. Snow still lay crisp upon the hedgerows, muffling the village sounds, and her boots pressed small, precise marks into the white. She let herself into the kitchen by way of the scullery, nodding to the bewildered constable stationed at the door. A harmless old lady, after all, could hardly raise alarm. The kitchen smelled faintly of coal and cinnamon. Miss Marple looked about with the sharp, unhurried gaze of one who missed nothing. Teacups on the dresser, pans neatly hung, a plate of stale buns half covered with muslin. And there, in the pantry, rows of tins lined upon the shelf, Prudence Harrow's prized collection of teas. She was known for them, a dozen varieties from India and Ceylon, always spoken of with pride, always offered with ceremony. Yet as Miss Marple's finger traced lightly along the shelf, she noticed a curious gap. A space between the Earl Grey and the Darjeeling, just wide enough for one tin. Dust had gathered faintly at the edges, marking where it had sat. And now it was gone. Miss Marple pursed her lips. A missing tin, from a collection never carelessly disturbed. The very shelf that would have provided the fatal cup. Her eyes narrowed, and she whispered into the still pantry air. "Now, that is most interesting indeed." Chapter 4. The Silent Widows. The Ellingham house stood a little apart from the rest of Willowbrook, its garden bare now under the weight of snow. Miss Marple, leaning lightly on her stick, followed the narrow path to the door, her breath puffing white in the chill air. She had known Mrs. Ellingham these many years, a gentle, fretful woman with anxious eyes, whose voice always seemed to tremble on the edge of confession. Tonight, she looked particularly pale as she ushered Miss Marple into the drawing-room. The fire crackled on the hearth, yet the room felt curiously cold, as though warmth could not quite take hold. Miss Marple seated herself in a chintz armchair, accepting the offered cup of tea, though she noted how the widow's hands shook so that the spoon rattled against the china. "It's a dreadful business, Jane," Mrs. Ellingham began, her voice low, as if fearful of being overheard. "Poor Prudence, gone so suddenly. One can scarcely take it in." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression mild, inviting confidences without the burden of direct inquiry. After a silence, Mrs. Ellingham leaned closer, her eyes darting toward the door. "You see, Prudence was not always kind. She had a way of reminding us, the rest of us widows, that our past was not as spotless as we should like the village to believe." Miss Marple raised her brows, but said nothing. Silence, she knew, was often the most potent spur to revelation. "There was something," Mrs. Ellingham whispered, wringing her thin hands together. "During the war, when our husbands were all involved in one committee or another. Funds collected for relief work, a great deal of money, really, and somehow it was never fully accounted for. My Harold swore it was merely confusion, but the records— oh, the records were never right. And Prudence, she liked to suggest she knew exactly who had mislaid them." Her voice trailed off into a nervous rustle of skirts. Miss Marple, knitting her fingers together gently in her lap, recalled similar patterns. How secrets, when shared among a group, became chains binding each one to the other. A chain, of course, that could be tugged by the strongest or the cruelest. She would bring it up. Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Ellingham's lips tightened. More often of late, especially these last weeks. She had a look in her eye, a determined look, as though she meant to make something public. The clock on the mantel ticked with an almost accusatory note. Mrs. Ellingham's face had gone blotchy, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Suddenly, with a sharp intake of breath, she blurted, "Prudence threatened to expose us all." The words seemed to hang in the dim room, louder than the crackle of the fire, more chilling than the wind against the shutters. Miss Marple's gaze rested gently on the widow, her eyes thoughtful, her mind already tracing the lines of fear and motive that threaded through the village like cracks beneath the snow. Back in her own sitting-room, Miss Marple found the fire had sunk to a bed of glowing embers. She laid on another small log, listening to the familiar snap as it caught, and settled into her chair with her knitting in her lap. Yet her needles did not move. Instead, her mind returned, with a curious insistence, to Mrs. Ellingham's trembling words, "Prudence threatened to expose us all." It was not the first time Miss Marple had seen such patterns in a village. Human nature, after all, was much the same whether one lived in St. Mary Mead, Willowbrook, or the heart of London itself. Secrets, especially those of money or reputation, had a way of fermenting quietly until they turned sour. A little dishonesty during the war, a fund misplaced, a record conveniently muddled, could be forgiven once. But allow it to linger in memory, and it became a weapon. Prudence Harrow, with her keen tongue and imperious manner, would never have scrupled to wield such a weapon. The widows of Willowbrook, bound by shared guilt, must have dreaded her hints and insinuations. But fear alone did not kill. Which one among them had the courage, or desperation, to silence Prudence forever? Miss Marple lifted her pen and drew a sheet of notepaper towards her. In her neat, spidery hand, she composed a short request to the vicar. Might she, in the interest of parish history, have a look at the records of war relief funds kept during those years? She smiled faintly as she folded the note. Villages were rather like books, she thought. One only had to find the missing page to understand the whole story. The next afternoon, the vicar, amiable but absent-minded, brought down the bound volume of records from a high shelf in his study. Dust motes danced in the pale winter light as Miss Marple opened the ledger. Page after page held careful entries, dates, sums, names of contributors, notes in the tidy hand of the parish clerk. But then, quite suddenly, her fingers brushed against a jagged edge. One sheet had been cleanly removed. Not torn, not fallen loose, but cut with deliberate care, as though by a sharp blade. Miss Marple paused, her lips pursing in that familiar way her neighbors had come to associate with dangerous thought. The missing leaf spoke louder than any written sum could. Someone, at some point, had gone to considerable trouble to excise a truth best left unrecorded. She closed the book gently, smoothing her hands across its worn cover. "Now," she murmured, "that is most singular indeed." The fire in the vicar's grate gave a sudden hiss, as though punctuating her words. And in that quiet room, Miss Marple felt the pattern forming, the threads drawing closer together. Somewhere behind that missing page lay the shadow of motive, and perhaps the hand of a killer. Chapter 5. Ashes in the Fireplace. The vicarage at Willowbrook was always a kindly house, though seldom a tidy one. Books leaned precariously on every table, hymnals mingled with seed catalogues, and a faint, perpetual fragrance of beeswax polish lingered in the air. Miss Marple, shown in by the vicar's distracted housemaid, stepped carefully over a pair of muddy galoshes that had been abandoned in the hall. "Mrs. Harrow will be with you directly, ma'am," the maid murmured and bustled off. Miss Marple seated herself in a high-backed chair beside the hearth. It was a chilly afternoon. Frost clung stubbornly to the window-panes. The fire crackled cheerfully enough, yet her eye, sharp as ever, was drawn not to the flames, but to what lay half-buried within the ashes. The blackened remnants of paper, curled and fragile, gave off a faint scorched tang. At that moment Mrs. Harrow appeared, fluttering slightly as she always did. She was a delicate woman with pale hair and gentle manners, easily flustered in conversation. "My dear Miss Marple, what a treat! Do forgive the muddle. The vicar insists on keeping every scrap of paper, and sometimes one must simply make a bonfire of them." Her voice trailed off as she noticed Miss Marple's gaze fixed upon the hearth. "Oh," she added hastily, color rising in her cheeks, "just old correspondence, nothing of consequence." Miss Marple, with an air of mild innocence, leaned forward. Her knitting bag tipped as though by accident, and as she stooped to retrieve it, her eyes caught a surviving corner of parchment not yet wholly consumed. The fire had licked at the edges, but one phrase remained starkly legible, written in Prudence Hathaway's neat, commanding hand. "If you will not confess, I must." The words stood out as though lit from within. Miss Marple's hand paused upon her knitting needles, her expression entirely bland. "How very sensible," she murmured softly, as though speaking of the fire rather than the letter. Mrs. Harrow fluttered again, attempting to change the subject. "Do let me fetch you some seed cake. You mustn't think me a poor hostess." But her tone was uneasy, her fingers fiddling with her apron hem. Miss Marple saw the tremor there, the nervous half-smile of a woman caught unawares. It was clear Mrs. Harrow had no wish to explain why Prudence Hathaway's words, ominous and accusing, should be reduced to ashes in her hearth. "Such dreadful weather for walking," Miss Marple said gently, allowing her hostess a reprieve. "One is grateful for a warm fire. I wonder, though, does the vicar find it difficult to part with old letters?" "Oh, impossibly difficult!" Mrs. Harrow exclaimed, seizing the safer subject with relief. "He hoards them. I must clear them away now and then, or the house would drown in papers." Miss Marple smiled politely, but her mind was working with calm precision. That letter had not been the vicar's, it had been Prudence's, and its tone was unmistakable, not affectionate, not friendly, but threatening. In that instant, Miss Marple understood something vital. Prudence Hathaway had been pressing someone, perhaps several someones, with knowledge they could not afford to see revealed. Miss Marple realized, with the quiet certainty of experience, that Prudence Hathaway had been blackmailing someone in Willowbrook. The quiet rhythm of Willowbrook was broken once more, as if the snow itself carried whispers of dread from cottage to cottage. News spread with the swiftness of wind down the lanes. Mrs. Lytton had been found collapsed in her own drawing-room, the heavy brass candlestick lying ominously near her hand. It was her housemaid who discovered her mistress, barely conscious upon the carpet, the tea-table overturned, and a faint trace of blood at her temple. Within minutes, neighbors hurried in, coats thrown hastily over nightgowns, breath pluming white in the bitter evening air. Constable Green stood uncertainly by the hearth, staring at the candlestick as if it alone might confess. Inspector Crail arrived from Marleycombe before dawn, striding through the hall with his usual briskness. "A burglar, without a doubt," he declared, though no drawer was rifled, no jewel-box opened, no coin disturbed. His voice carried a confidence not wholly shared by those who listened. For Mrs. Lytton, feverish and trembling, had stirred briefly and whispered in her half-delirium, "She knew too much! She knew too much!" The words clung in the hush of the room long after she sank back into unconsciousness. Miss Marple stood quietly among the cluster of anxious villagers, her small frame wrapped in a grey shawl, her eyes taking in every detail. A burglary, indeed? No footprints marked the snow near the side door. No latch was forced. And candlesticks did not, of their own accord, lift themselves to strike at widows who knew inconvenient truths. Later, walking slowly home beneath the cold gleam of the moon, Miss Marple reflected on the grim symmetry. First Prudence Harrow, silenced at her fireside. Now Mrs. Lytton, bludgeoned in her drawing-room. Both widows, both tied to the same shadowed past. It was less the pattern of chance than of a hand seeking methodical erasure. As she passed the hedge bordering Mrs. Lytton's garden, her sharp eyes caught a faint glimmer against the snow. Stooping with a care that belied her years, she brushed aside the icy crust and lifted a small object into the moonlight. A glove. Delicate, feminine, finely stitched. The mate, beyond all doubt, to the solitary glove she had found days earlier beneath Prudence's hedge. Miss Marple held it a moment in her palm, the snowflakes melting against its pale fabric. In the stillness of the lane, she felt the threads of the mystery draw tighter, the noose of motive and fear narrowing upon the circle of widows. Straightening with quiet resolve, she tucked the glove into her pocket. To others, it might be dismissed as a trifle lost by chance. But to Miss Marple, small things were never trifles. They were the very stepping-stones by which truth was reached. The wind stirred the bare branches above, whispering like voices from the past. Miss Marple walked on, her steps slow but steady, the weight of certainty pressing ever heavier upon her mind. Somebody was silencing secrets, and the widows of Willowbrook were running out of time. Chapter 6. The House Where Widows Keep Their Secrets. The sitting-room of Miss Marple's cottage was warm with the glow of lamplight and the scent of newly baked scones. Outside, a brittle frost lay across the village like a pale sheet, but within all was comfort, polished silver on the tea-tray, a fire that snapped cheerily in the grate, and the gentle murmur of voices. Yet beneath the surface of that gathering hovered something altogether less tranquil. For it was not often that Mrs. Ellingham, Mrs. Lytton, and Mrs. Weatherby sat side by side, and rarer still at Miss Marple's hearth. They had come, of course, out of politeness. One did not easily decline an invitation from the quiet, bird-like spinster who saw everything and said so little. Still, as cups clinked and teaspoons stirred, there was a nervous edge to the conversation, like the tremor of strings before they snap. Mrs. Ellingham spoke too quickly, too lightly, about the severity of the winter, her hands twisting one another in her lap. She declined the seed cake, claiming her digestion was not what it had been. Miss Marple, who knew her fondness for it in years past, merely nodded and offered shortbread instead. Mrs. Lytton, pale and weak from her recent ordeal, sat very straight, her eyes flicking now and then toward her son Harold, though he was not present. At each mention of Prudence Harrow's name, her fingers tightened around the arm of her chair, a gesture that betrayed far more than her carefully chosen words. And Mrs. Weatherby, usually the most placid of the three, spilled a drop of tea upon her saucer and attempted to laugh it off, though her hand continued to tremble long after. She kept dabbing at her napkin, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze, and once, when Mrs. Lytton remarked on old times, she gave such a start that her spoon clattered loudly against the china. Miss Marple poured more tea, her manner mild, her voice soothing, as though nothing of consequence were being weighed in the balance. She spoke of parish matters, of the vicar's new sermon, even of the birds at her winter feeder. Yet her eyes, blue and deceptively mild, saw every twitch, every withheld word. The conversation lulled, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic tick of the mantel clock. The air grew thick with unsaid things. Secrets lay between these women like shadows cast long across the snow. Miss Marple, with her needles resting idly in her lap, knew each shadow pointed toward something darker still. As she leaned forward to offer more milk, her glance lifted to the window. There, half shrouded by the frost-patterned pane, stood Harold Lytton. His figure loomed against the pale dusk, his eyes fixed upon the little gathering within. Cold eyes, watchful eyes, eyes that did not belong to a casual passer-by. Miss Marple's hand stilled for the briefest moment, the jug of milk poised above the cup. Then, with her customary calm, she set it down and resumed her gentle chatter. But inwardly, her thought was sharp as steel. The shadows are gathering, and not all of them belong to the widows. The evening after her little gathering, Miss Marple sat once more in the familiar quiet of her cottage. The fire burned low, its glow warming the polished brass on the mantel, and the winter wind rattled faintly at the panes. She drew her knitting close, but allowed it to lie idle across her lap, her thoughts weaving a far more intricate pattern than any stitch could manage. The picture was slowly arranging itself in her mind, though as yet the lines remained hazy. Prudence Harrow had wielded her knowledge like a blade, keeping the other widows in her thrall. The scandal of their husbands, mislaid funds, whispered impropriety, was not merely village gossip, but a weapon capable of ruining reputations even after so many years. That much was clear from Mrs. Ellingham's trembling, Mrs. Lytton's evasions, and Mrs. Weatherby's nervous spills. And yet, Miss Marple pursed her lips. Those three women were bound by silence, yes, but they were also bound by fear. Their manner was not the cold defiance of guilt, but the anxious fluttering of those terrified of what might come to light. She knew fear well, and it was not the same as cunning. The evidence, such as it was, bore another signature entirely. The glove, delicate and fine, misplaced near the hedge. The missing tea tin from Prudence's pantry, an artless substitute for poison. The planted vial in Alice's trunk, too clumsy a trick for the careful hands of middle-aged women who knew better than to tempt further scrutiny. No, these were not the marks of seasoned widows guarding a decades-old scandal. They were the signs of someone younger, someone reckless enough to take bold risks, and desperate enough to do so without finesse. someone whose stake was tied not to past misdeeds, but to the future. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the window, where the frost etched its lace across the glass. Harold Lytton's face returned to her mind, the way he had watched the tea from outside, his gaze too steady, too cold. A son, an heir, a young man with all the impetuousness of youth and perhaps all the burdens of family secrets. Could it be Harold Hathaway, with his nervous manner, or Harold Lytton, with his watchful eyes? The threads tangled, but she felt the pull of youth in each. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. In St. Mary Mead, she had once known a boy who stole from the church plate, not from malice, but from a terror of disappointing his family. Desperation, she thought, drove the young to folly. Her reverie was broken by a knock at the door. On her threshold stood Mrs. Pierce, a villager whose tongue was as swift as her knitting needles. She leaned close, whispering as though the snow might carry her words away. "I saw Harold Hathaway," she said breathlessly, "enter his aunt's house the night she died." The wind moaned against the eaves, and Miss Marple's eyes opened wide, sharp with new certainty. The threads were drawing tighter still. Chapter 7. The Final Trap. The snow outside lay thick and unbroken, a quiet shroud over Willowbrook, but within Miss Marple's cottage the fire burned bright, and the scent of seed cake mingled with fresh brewed tea. It was a scene of homeliness and comfort, and yet beneath its surface tension coiled tight. Miss Marple had arranged her little gathering with her usual air of gentle fussing, as though it were nothing more than a neighborly kindness. But in her mind, every place at the table, every cup, had been carefully chosen. Inspector Crail arrived first, stamping snow from his boots, his confidence as brash as ever. "A useful meeting, Miss Marple," he declared, eyeing the assembled widows with a brisk nod. "We shall have matters cleared up once and for all." His tone suggested he expected to preside. Miss Marple, smiling serenely, merely guided him toward his chair. Mrs. Lytton, pale and still recovering from her ordeal, sat stiffly, her son Harold hovering behind her like a shadow. Mrs. Ellingham and Mrs. Weatherby followed, each hiding their disquiet behind polite murmurs. They might have been attending a funeral rather than a tea. Miss Marple, her knitting basket pushed aside, busied herself with the teapot. "Just a little something to warm us all," she said kindly, though her eyes flicked toward Harold. The young man avoided her gaze, his fingers restless against the back of his mother's chair. She moved slowly, with all the unhurried grace of an elderly hostess, pouring out cups one by one. Inspector Crail received his with pompous thanks, the widow's with murmured gratitude. At last, she set a cup before Harold. It was plain white porcelain, identical to the others save for one detail invisible to all but Miss Marple. It was the very cup Prudence Hathaway had favored. Harold looked down at it. For an instant his face remained expressionless. Then, as though struck by some unbidden terror, the color drained from his cheeks. His hand twitched but did not reach. He pushed the cup away with a sudden, almost violent gesture. "I don't want any," he stammered, his voice rough. "I don't care for tea." The room fell into a stunned silence. Mrs. Lytton turned sharply to her son. Inspector Crail narrowed his eyes. Even the timid Mrs. Weatherby paused, her trembling spoon stilled mid-air. Miss Marple folded her hands lightly on the table, her eyes gentle but steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet and almost conversational, carrying easily in the charged air. "Strange," she observed, "that you should fear the very cup your aunt drank from." Her words dropped like a stone into water, the ripples spreading across the room. The widows glanced at one another in shock, Mrs. Litton's hand flying to her throat. Crail half rose, ready with some blustering question. But it was Harold's face that told the story. His lips parted as if to deny, then closed again. His breath quickened. He looked not at Miss Marple, nor at the inspector, but at the cup, as though it alone carried the weight of his guilt. The trap had been sprung. For a moment, silence ruled the little sitting-room. Only the steady tick of the mantel clock broke it, punctuating the hush that followed Miss Marple's quiet remark. Harold sat rigid, pale, his eyes darting from face to face like a trapped animal. Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression almost grandmotherly, though her words were as sharp as pins. "You see, Harold, one cannot mistake true fear. Not fear of tea, nor of illness, but fear of exposure. You knew your aunt meant to alter her will. Prudence Hathaway, for all her severity, did not forgive youthful folly. And she had overheard you, plotting to secure money not rightly yours." Mrs. Litton gasped. "Harold, my son—" But Miss Marple continued gently, with the tone of one explaining a household puzzle. "Your aunt threatened to see you cut off entirely, did she not? Worse still, she threatened to bring the matter of those old war funds to light, the very scandal that bound these good ladies together in silence. You could not allow her to speak." Harold's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His hands clenched on his knees. "You were clever, but not quite clever enough," Miss Marple went on. "You plucked aconite from her own winter garden, deadly, yet unremarkable to anyone who does not know the signs. You stirred it into her tea, and when the poor maid, Alice, seemed a convenient scapegoat, you planted the evidence in her trunk. It was the sort of trick a boy might think conclusive, but it reeked of haste." Inspector Crail shifted, his brows furrowing. Miss Marple glanced at him, then back at Harold. "And those little gloves," she added softly, "so dainty, half buried in snow. They were your mother's, were they not? Stolen to throw suspicion elsewhere. But they betrayed you. Too large a scheme for a simple village maid." Mrs. Litton's face drained of color. "Harold, tell me it isn't true." Still he did not answer. His silence was damning. And when poor Mrs. Litton here began to recall things, certain letters, certain quarrels, you struck her down in desperation, hoping to silence her as you silenced your aunt. A candlestick is hardly subtle, but then desperation rarely is. At last Harold surged to his feet, his chair scraping back. His face was twisted with something between anger and despair. "You've no proof. You're just an old woman with her knitting and her stories," he cried. But before he could take another step, a firm hand pressed him down again. Inspector Crail had risen, his grip iron on Harold's shoulder. "That will do," he said grimly. "I think we've heard enough." Miss Marple, serene as ever, folded her hands once more. Her eyes rested on Harold, not unkindly, but with the steady weight of truth. The boy struggled beneath the constable's hold, his composure broken at last. And in the stillness that followed, it seemed even the fire crackled more quietly, as if the cottage itself were listening to the unmasking of a killer. Harold leapt up, but Inspector Crail laid a firm hand on his shoulder. Chapter 8. When the Snow Melts. The winter sun lingered longer each day now, glancing off the thawing rooftops and dripping steadily from eaves. In Willowbrook, the hush of shock began, at last, to ease. Doors that had closed tightly in suspicion swung open again, and voices once lowered in fear rose to their natural pitch, trading not darker rumors but the ordinary chatter of butter prices and hymn choices for Sunday service. At the little jail in Marleycombe, Alice was freed. Her tears spilled down her cheeks as she stumbled out into the thin sunlight, clutching her shawl about her shoulders. "I never did nothing, miss," she kept saying, half to the inspector, half to the air. And when Miss Marple pressed a warm hand into hers, the poor girl broke into sobs of such relief that even Inspector Crail cleared his throat and turned away. The charge had melted as quickly as the frost on the hedgerows. Back in the village, the widows walked once more to church, their heads bowed not in pride but in quiet shame. They exchanged polite greetings and shared pews, yet in their eyes a shadow lingered, a reminder that silence, too, can be a burden. They knew Miss Marple had seen it, the trace of guilt that never wholly lifts, the old scandal that time alone cannot erase. Still, the villagers whispered with admiration. "She's done it again, our Miss Marple," murmured Mrs. Bantry at the grocer's, lowering her voice though everyone agreed. "Saw what the police could not." And others nodded knowingly, as if such wisdom were as natural to her as knitting a row of plain stitches. As for Miss Marple herself, she tended her little garden, stooping among the winter aconites that pushed bravely through the slush. To the casual eye, she was quite unchanged, an elderly lady with nimble fingers, remarking on the weather, setting seed in careful rows. Yet her thoughts were not idle. She reflected, as she often did, on the strange patterns of human folly, greed dressed as ambition, fear disguised as dignity, love curdled into bitterness. To her, these were not mysteries, but the eternal habits of mankind, repeated as faithfully as the seasons. Still, she sighed softly to herself as she gathered her knitting and prepared to light the evening fire. For every wrong uncovered, another always seemed to stir beneath the surface, waiting its turn. That night, as dusk folded gently over Willowbrook, there came a knock at her door. A village boy, cheeks reddened from the chill, handed her a sealed envelope and bobbed away without a word. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and broke the seal. Inside lay a short letter, neatly written in Mrs. Ellingham's trembling hand. It thanked her, oh yes, most sincerely, for her wisdom and discretion. Yet beneath the polite phrases lay a single line that caught Miss Marple's breath. Some secrets do not stay buried. Cliffhanger. A final letter arrives at Miss Marple's door, from Mrs. Ellingham, thanking her but warning, some secrets do not stay buried. The weeks slipped by gently, and winter, stubborn though it had been, at last began to loosen its hold. Snow dwindled to damp patches along the verges, and in the hedgerows green tips of hawthorn pushed forth with quiet determination. Birds, bold and busy, returned to their nesting places, their songs carrying a promise of brighter days across the village lanes. At her cottage window, Miss Marple sat with her knitting spread lightly over her lap. The needles clicked softly, as steady as her own breathing, a rhythm both soothing and companionable. She was not thinking of murder, not now. Instead, her mind wandered along those familiar paths of observation, the small truths of human nature she had long kept close. She thought of Prudence Harrow, proud, sharp-tongued, and yet vulnerable to her own desires for power. She thought of Alice, so easily suspected, because maids so often carried the blame for mischief above their station. And she thought of Harold, young, foolish, blinded by ambition, and yet not unlike others she had known, who believed they could outwit both conscience and community. Pride, weakness, kindness, she murmured softly, pausing to adjust a stitch. All tangled together, like dropped threads in a piece of lace. Pull at one, and the whole pattern shows itself. Her eyes strayed to the garden beyond, where crocuses had begun to bloom in shy clusters of purple and white. It pleased her, this quiet perseverance of life, as though the earth itself knew how to endure and renew, no matter how cold the season that came before. Willowbrook, too, endured, a village full of small secrets, of gossip and grace, of quarrels and reconciliations. To Miss Marple it was a tapestry, and she loved it all the more for its flaws. Now and again she recalled Mrs. Ellingham's letter with its careful warning. Some secrets do not stay buried. That, she thought, was likely true. Yet perhaps it was not always a matter of uncovering them, but of knowing when to let them rest. She had learned long ago that truth could wound as much as it could heal, and that wisdom often meant choosing silence as carefully as speech. A faint smile curved her lips. For all the storms, she was content. The fire crackled warmly at her side, the scent of beeswax and lavender polish lingered in the air, and the steady sound of her needles was as reassuring as the tick of a clock. Life, she knew, would always bring new puzzles, new sorrows, new joys. And she would be ready, in her quiet way, to see them for what they were. Outside, the church bells began to toll, slow and measured, marking the hour. Their sound drifted over the village, over the gardens and fields, mingling with the first songs of spring birds. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, folded her hands, and listened. The church bells toll softly, and life goes on. And so, dear listener, our tale in Willowbrook draws to its close. The mystery of Prudence Harrow's death has been untangled, Harold unmasked, and the innocent set free. Yet, as in all villages, whether nestled among English hedgerows or in the bustle of a town street, life goes quietly on, layered with secrets, whispers, and the everyday dramas that never quite make their way into official reports. For every secret uncovered, another lingers in shadow, waiting for its time. It is the way of communities, is it not? Every friendly smile at the greengrocer's counter, every polite nod at the post office may conceal a story untold. Pride, grief, jealousy, kindness, all weave themselves into the fabric of village life. And though crime may be rare, human folly is never far away. Miss Marple, with her gentle patience, has always understood this truth. She sees not merely the crime, but the people, their motives, their fears, their small vanities and tender hopes. Picture her now, sitting by her fire as snow drips from the eaves, a teapot steaming gently on the tray beside her. Her knitting needles click steadily, the flames casting golden light upon her face. Outside, spring waits just beyond the hedges. Inside, peace reigns, at least for the moment. But tell me, did you suspect Harold from the start? Or did you, like many in Willowbrook, think one of the widows had struck out in desperation? I should very much like to know your thoughts. If you've enjoyed this journey into quiet intrigue, do be kind enough to like this tale, share your theories in the comments, and subscribe for more mysteries. Until next time, may your evenings be cozy, your tea hot, and your secret safe.